Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a quiet hospital, founded centuries ago to care for the poor and the sick, slowly became the most famous place in England associated with madness? Tonight's journey takes us to medieval London, to a place whose name would echo across centuries, Bethlem Royal Hospital. Over time, its name would change in the mouths of Londoners. Bethlem would become Bedlam, a word that eventually came to mean confusion, disorder and chaos. But behind that word was a real place, with real people, and a long history shaped by the beliefs, fears and medical ideas of each passing age. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, let me know where in the world you're listening from tonight and what your local time is as this story begins. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins in London during the 13th century, long before the city became the crowded capital we know today. At that time, London was still a medieval town surrounded by defensive walls first built by the Romans. Narrow streets wound between timber houses, and the sounds of markets and church bells carried through the air each day. Life moved according to rhythms that had changed little for generations. People worked with their hands, travelled mostly on foot, and relied heavily on the guidance of the church. Hospitals in this world were very different from modern medical centres. They were not primarily places for surgery or complex treatment. Instead, they were institutions of charity. Most hospitals existed to provide shelter, food, and basic care for those who could not care for themselves. The sick, poor, elderly travellers, orphans, and the disabled often depended on these religious foundations. Many were run by monastic communities or church officials who believed caring for the vulnerable was part of their spiritual duty. In the year 1247, a small hospital was founded just outside the city walls of London. It was established by a man named Simon Fitzmary, a former sheriff of London who later became deeply involved in religious life. Fitzmary donated land and resources to create a hospital dedicated to St. Mary of Bethlehem. The name Bethlehem referred to the biblical birthplace of Jesus, and many religious institutions of the time were named after holy places. The hospital was intended to provide care for the poor and needy under the protection of the church. At its beginning, Bethlem was a modest institution. Historical records suggest it held only a small number of residents, perhaps fewer than a dozen at any given time. The buildings were simple. Patients slept in shared spaces, and daily life followed routines shaped by religious practice. Clergy and attendants oversaw the hospital, and prayer played an important role in its daily structure. The belief at the time was that spiritual care and physical care were closely connected. Illness was often understood through a religious lens, and many people believed that prayer could help restore balance to a troubled mind or body. During these early years, Bethlem was not specifically known for treating mental illness. Instead, it functioned as a general charitable hospital. Some residents may have been ill, others elderly or disabled, and some simply too poor to survive on their own. However, medieval society had few places for people who behaved in ways that others considered strange or disturbing. When someone in a community showed signs of what we would now recognize as mental illness, families often struggled to manage the situation. Without modern medicine or psychology, explanations for unusual behavior were uncertain. Some believed the mind could become unbalanced due to physical causes within the body. Others saw madness as a spiritual problem, possibly linked to sin, moral weakness, or supernatural forces. Because of this uncertainty, communities sometimes placed individuals who behaved unpredictably into institutions like hospitals or monasteries. These places offered supervision and shelter, even if they did not fully understand the nature of the illness. Gradually, Bethlem began receiving more residents, whose behaviour seemed unusual or difficult for families to manage. This shift did not happen suddenly. It developed slowly over decades, as London grew and the population expanded. By the late Middle Ages, London was becoming one of the largest cities in England. Trade increased, markets expanded, and more people moved into the city seeking work. With a larger population came a wider range of social problems. Poverty, illness, and homelessness became more visible within the crowded streets. Institutions like Bethlem found themselves caring for people whose needs did not fit easily into other categories. Some residents may have spoken incoherently or behaved unpredictably. Others might have experienced deep sadness, confusion, or agitation that families did not know how to address. Without a clear understanding of mental health, caretakers often treated these individuals as patients suffering from a mysterious form of illness. Records from the late medieval period begin to show that Bethlem was increasingly associated with those described as distracted or lunatic, terms used at the time to describe mental disturbance. Even so, the hospital remained small. Its staff consisted of a handful of attendants who managed the daily routines of feeding residents, maintaining the building, and ensuring order within the wards. The environment inside Bethlem during these early centuries was quiet compared to the later reputation it would develop. Life followed predictable patterns. Meals were simple and repetitive. Bread, porridge, vegetables, and occasionally meat formed the basis of the diet. Residents slept in shared rooms, often on simple bedding or straw mattresses. Attendants watched over them throughout the day. Their responsibilities included maintaining discipline, preventing residents from harming themselves or others, and ensuring that daily routines were followed. Methods of control were often basic. Restraints could be used if someone became aggressive or difficult to manage. These methods reflected the limited understanding of mental illness at the time. Most attendants were not trained physicians. They were workers tasked with maintaining order rather than providing medical treatment. For medieval Londoners, Bethlem remained a relatively obscure institution for many years. The hospital existed quietly on the edge of the city's awareness. Its small population and modest size meant that few people outside the immediate neighbourhood thought much about it. Yet the idea of madness itself held a powerful place in medieval imagination. Stories circulated about individuals who behaved in unusual ways. Some were treated with sympathy, others with fear or curiosity. Writers and religious thinkers sometimes described madness as a condition that blurred the line between human reason and chaos. Within that cultural atmosphere, places like Bethlem slowly took on a symbolic role. They became spaces where society placed individuals whose behaviour no longer fit within everyday expectations. By the 15th century, Bethlem had begun to develop a more distinct identity. Documents from the period suggest that the hospital was increasingly associated with the care of people considered mentally disturbed. The number of such residents slowly increased, and the hospital's reputation began to shift. London itself was also changing during this period. The medieval city was growing denser. Wooden houses crowded together along narrow lanes, and markets filled the streets with merchants, craftsmen, and travellers from across England and Europe. Life could be unpredictable in such an environment. Economic hardship, disease outbreaks, and social tension were common. Institutions like Bethlem reflected the way society attempted to manage these pressures. They provided a controlled environment where individuals who could not easily function within ordinary life could be placed under supervision. From the outside, Bethlem still looked like a modest hospital. Its buildings were not especially large or elaborate. Yet the institution was slowly becoming something different from what its founders had originally imagined. Over the coming centuries, Bethlem would move through several transformations. Its physical buildings would change location. Its staff would expand and include physicians. The number of patients would grow. At the same time, the wider world around it would also evolve. Ideas about medicine, the human mind, and the responsibilities of institutions would slowly develop across Europe. Bethlem's story would follow these changes closely. In time, the hospital would become both famous and infamous. It would be discussed in newspapers, visited by curious members of the public, and criticised by reformers who believed patients deserved more humane treatment. But in these earliest centuries, none of that future was yet visible. Bethlem was still a small charitable hospital founded in the spirit of medieval faith. Within its walls lived a handful of people whose minds troubled them in ways that neither their families nor their society fully understood. Attendants kept watch over them, following routines that had become familiar through repetition. Outside the hospital, London continued to grow. Merchants negotiated in crowded markets, church bells marked the passing hours, and the Thames carried ships bringing goods from distant ports. The city's life flowed steadily onward, while within Bethlem a quieter story unfolded, one shaped by changing ideas about illness, responsibility, and care. That story would continue to develop as England moved from the medieval world into the early modern age. New beliefs about medicine, authority, and social order would begin to influence how institutions like Bethlem operated. And slowly, the hospital that had once been only a small charitable refuge would become something far more widely known. Its name would begin to travel through the streets of London. The hospital, founded in 1247 under the name St. Mary of Bethlehem, continued to exist quietly within the growing city of London as the later decades of the 13th century unfolded. It remained a religious foundation, governed according to the charitable traditions that shaped many institutions of the medieval world. Its original purpose had been simple: to provide care and shelter for those who could not easily survive on their own. In practice, this meant offering space to the poor, the elderly, and the sick, especially those who lacked family support. The structure of such hospitals reflected the close relationship between religion and daily life during this era. Bethlem was overseen by a small religious community connected to the Order of the Star of Bethlehem, a monastic group established to maintain the hospital and carry out its charitable mission. The leadership of the institution included a master or prior responsible for administration, along with brothers who managed routine duties and attended to residents. Their work followed a rhythm shaped by prayer, labour, and service. Religious observance framed the day. Bells signalled times for worship, meals, and rest. The belief that spiritual devotion could support physical healing guided the way patients were treated. Care was not organised around modern medical science, but rather around the medieval conviction that the well-being of the soul and the body were closely connected. Records from the 13th and early 14th centuries describe Bethlem as a small institution. Its buildings likely consisted of a chapel, dormitory spaces, and basic service areas used for cooking and storage. The hospital did not yet resemble the large institutions that would appear centuries later. Instead, it functioned more like a household community in which attendants and residents lived within the same modest complex. Residents were referred to as inmates, a word that at the time simply meant those who lived within the hospital. They shared sleeping spaces and common meals. The food was plain but intended to sustain health. Bread formed the foundation of most meals, often accompanied by broth or vegetables. On certain days, meat might be provided, depending on availability and religious dietary customs. Clothing was basic and practical. Many residents arrived with very little of their own, and the hospital sometimes provided garments donated by benefactors or purchased through charitable funds. Bedding often consisted of straw-filled mattresses placed on wooden frames or simple platforms. Daily supervision fell to attendants whose responsibilities were broad. They ensured that meals were distributed, that residents followed established routines, and that the hospital environment remained orderly. These attendants were not trained medical specialists. Their role resembled that of caretakers or overseers who managed the practical needs of the institution. During the early years of Bethlem's operation, there is little evidence that it was specifically dedicated to the care of those with mental disturbances. Instead, it accepted individuals facing a variety of hardships. Some residents suffered from physical illness that required rest and basic nursing care. Others were elderly individuals without family support. However, the hospital's structure made it a place where people with unusual behaviour could also be housed when necessary. Medieval communities lacked specialised institutions for mental health care. Families often bore responsibility for relatives who displayed confusion, erratic behaviour, or deep melancholy. When such conditions became difficult to manage, placing a person within a charitable hospital could provide supervision and stability. This gradual shift did not involve formal policies or official declarations. It emerged naturally from circumstance. Bethlem had space, attendance, and a charitable mission. As a result, individuals who struggled to function within ordinary life sometimes found their way there. The broader society of medieval England held complex ideas about the nature of the human mind. Mental disturbance was not yet understood as a medical condition in the modern sense. Instead, explanations varied widely depending on cultural, religious, and philosophical perspectives. One influential idea came from classical medicine, especially the teachings of ancient Greek physicians such as Hippocrates and Galen. These traditions suggested that the human body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health depended on maintaining balance among these substances. If the humours became imbalanced, illness could occur, including disturbances of mood or thought. According to this theory, excessive black bile might produce deep sadness, while other imbalances could lead to agitation or confusion. Treatments aimed at restoring balance through diet, herbal remedies, or bloodletting. At the same time, religious explanations remained powerful. Some people believed unusual behaviour might reflect spiritual struggle, moral failing, or the influence of unseen forces. Clergy sometimes attempted to address such problems through prayer, confession, or religious counselling. These different interpretations coexisted rather than replacing one another. Medieval society did not draw sharp boundaries between spiritual and physical causes of illness. Within Bethlem itself, care reflected these overlapping ideas. Residents were encouraged to participate in prayer and religious services, which were considered important for maintaining spiritual stability. At the same time, attendants attempted to maintain physical health through simple routines of food, rest, and supervision. The hospital relied heavily on charitable donations to sustain its operations. Wealthy patrons sometimes contributed money, land, or supplies as part of their religious duty. Supporting hospitals allowed donors to demonstrate piety while also helping the vulnerable members of society. City authorities occasionally became involved as well. Because Bethlem served London's population, civic leaders recognised its practical value. Providing a place for individuals who could not easily support themselves helped maintain order within the growing city. By the 14th century, London was becoming a far more active urban centre than it had been during Bethlem's founding. Trade routes expanded across Europe, bringing merchants and goods through the city. The population increased steadily, and neighbourhoods grew more crowded. With this expansion came greater visibility for institutions that dealt with social challenges. Poverty, illness, and displacement became more noticeable within the streets of London. Hospitals such as Bethlem played a quiet but important role in managing these conditions. They provided structured environments where people who struggled to survive independently could live under supervision. The Black Death, which struck England in the mid-14th century, also shaped the atmosphere in which Bethlem operated. The epidemic dramatically reduced the population and left lasting social effects. Many families were disrupted or destroyed, leaving vulnerable individuals without support. Hospitals and charitable institutions became even more significant during this time. They offered stability within a society adjusting to sudden demographic change. Bethlem continued to function through these turbulent decades. Its small community adapted as needed, accepting residents who required care and maintaining the routines that sustained the institution. Documents from later centuries suggest that by this period, the hospital had already begun developing a reputation associated with mental disturbance. The number of residents described as distracted or mad slowly increased. Yet the institution still retained its earlier identity as a charitable refuge, rather than a specialised asylum. The word asylum itself had not yet acquired its later meaning. In medieval usage, it simply referred to a place of safety or shelter. Bethlem served precisely that role for those who entered its gates. Within the hospital walls, life followed predictable patterns shaped by routine. Morning prayers marked the beginning of the day, Residents gathered for meals prepared in the hospital kitchen. Attendants monitored behaviour and intervened when necessary to maintain order. Some residents spent time walking within the hospital grounds or performing small tasks that helped pass the hours. Others rested quietly or required closer supervision if their condition caused agitation. Because medical understanding remained limited, treatment focused largely on managing behaviour rather than curing illness. Calm surroundings, predictable schedules, and basic physical care were considered important. Occasionally, physicians associated with the city might be consulted if a resident's condition appeared severe. These physicians operated according to the humoral theory that guided most medieval medicine. They might recommend dietary adjustments, herbal preparations, or procedures intended to rebalance the body's internal systems. However, such interventions were relatively rare compared to the everyday routines managed by attendants. Despite its modest scale, Bethlem gradually became part of London's social landscape. People living near the hospital grew familiar with its presence. Some likely knew individuals who had spent time there. Others may have heard stories circulating about unusual residents whose behaviour attracted attention. Over time, the association between Bethlem and mental disturbance grew stronger. This shift occurred slowly and almost quietly, without dramatic announcements or sudden transformation. It reflected broader changes in how society handled individuals whose behaviour challenged conventional expectations. As the 15th century approached, Bethlem stood at an early stage of a long evolution. The institution, founded as a charitable hospital, had begun moving toward a new identity. More residents were arriving whose conditions involved confusion, distress, or unpredictable behaviour. Caretakers adapted as best they could, using the tools and beliefs available to them. Meanwhile, London itself continued to expand and change. New political developments, economic growth, and shifting social structures would soon shape the city's institutions in new ways. Bethlem would remain part of that evolving landscape, gradually becoming more closely associated with the care and control of those whose minds troubled them. In the centuries ahead, the hospital's reputation would grow far beyond its modest beginnings. But during these early years, its story remained one of quiet charity, steady routine, and a society beginning to confront questions it did not yet fully understand. By the late medieval period, English society had developed several different ways of thinking about the human mind, and these ideas shaped how people understood unusual behaviour. When someone behaved in ways that appeared confused, withdrawn, or unpredictable, observers often tried to interpret the situation using a mixture of religious belief, inherited medical theory, and everyday experience. There was no single explanation that everyone accepted. Instead, multiple interpretations existed side by side, each influencing how individuals and communities responded. Medieval medical thought still relied heavily on the ancient humoral theory that had travelled from Greek and Roman medicine into European universities. According to this model, the body contained 4 main humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and health depended on keeping these substances balanced. If the humours shifted too far in one direction, illness could appear. This imbalance was believed to affect both the body and the mind. Physicians trained in this tradition described several conditions connected to disturbances of thought or emotion. One of the most commonly discussed was melancholy, which they associated with an excess of black bile. Melancholy was thought to produce sadness, quiet withdrawal, and deep reflection. Another condition, sometimes called mania, involved agitation, restless movement, and emotional intensity. Medical writers also describe states of confusion in which a person might lose the ability to reason clearly. These ideas circulated through universities, monasteries, and educated circles. Physicians in large towns such as London were familiar with them, though practical treatment remained limited. Adjusting diet, prescribing herbs, or using procedures such as bloodletting were among the methods used in attempts to restore balance within the body. At the same time, religious explanations continued to hold great influence in daily life. Many medieval Christians believed the human mind was closely connected to the soul. Disturbances of thought could therefore be interpreted as signs of spiritual struggle. Clergy sometimes viewed unusual behaviour through a moral lens, asking whether the individual might be experiencing temptation, despair, or inner conflict. Religious texts also describe moments when people seemed overwhelmed by forces beyond their control. In some situations, communities believed prayer or spiritual guidance might help restore stability. Priests and monks sometimes offered counsel to individuals experiencing distress, encouraging confession, reflection, and renewed participation in religious life. Because these explanations overlapped, families faced uncertainty when a relative began behaving in ways they could not easily understand. Some households tried to manage the situation privately, relying on care within the home. Others sought help from clergy, physicians, or local authorities. When those efforts did not provide a solution, institutions like Bethlem offered another possibility. By the 15th century, Bethlem had already become known within London as a place where individuals with troubled minds could be placed under supervision. The hospital's charitable foundation meant it remained open to people who lacked financial resources, and its staff had gradually gained experience dealing with residents whose behaviour required careful management. Although the hospital had not originally been designed specifically for this purpose, circumstances encouraged this role to grow. The presence of attendants and enclosed spaces made it possible to supervise individuals who might otherwise wander through the city or struggle to live safely within crowded households. The population of Bethlem remained small, but records indicate that several residents during this period were described as suffering from forms of mental disturbance. These individuals were sometimes referred to as lunatics, a word derived from the Latin luna, meaning moon. The term reflected a long-standing belief that phases of the moon could influence human behaviour. Some observers believed that emotional states might change according to lunar cycles. Periods of agitation or confusion were sometimes linked to the full moon, though the exact reasoning behind this idea varied from place to place. The belief was widespread enough that the term lunatic became common in legal and medical documents. Within Bethlem's walls, attendants worked to maintain order among residents whose conditions differed widely. Some patients may have been quiet and withdrawn, spending long periods in reflection or silence. Others might have experienced bursts of agitation or confusion that required closer supervision. Restraints were sometimes used when necessary to prevent harm. Chains, straps, or other simple devices allowed attendants to control movement if someone became physically aggressive or unable to remain calm. While such methods might appear harsh from a modern perspective, they reflected the limited understanding and resources available at the time. Daily routines provided a sense of structure that caretakers believed could help maintain stability. Meals occurred at regular hours. Residents were encouraged to rest at night and remain active during the day when possible. Attendants watched closely for signs of distress and intervened when needed. The hospital's connection to religious life continued to shape its atmosphere. Prayer services remained part of the daily schedule, and the chapel served as a central gathering place. Spiritual care was considered an important aspect of maintaining well-being. Visitors from outside the hospital were relatively rare during these early centuries. Bethlem had not yet developed the reputation that would later attract curious crowds. Instead, it functioned quietly as part of the city's network of charitable institutions. Still, stories occasionally circulated about individuals living within its walls. Londoners were naturally curious about unusual behaviour, and tales of strange or unpredictable actions could travel quickly through markets and neighbourhoods. These stories gradually contributed to Bethlem's growing association with madness. The hospital's name became linked with the idea of mental disturbance, even though it continued to care for residents facing a range of different hardships. Meanwhile, broader changes were taking place in English society. The late medieval period saw the gradual rise of stronger royal administration, expanding trade networks, and growing urban populations. London in particular experienced steady growth as merchants, craftsmen, and labourers moved into the city. This expanding population created new pressures within urban life. Housing became crowded, employment could be uncertain, and social tensions sometimes increased in densely populated neighbourhoods. Institutions like Bethlem helped absorb some of these pressures by offering a place where individuals who struggled to live independently could receive supervision. Although the hospital remained small, its role within the city slowly expanded. Legal authorities occasionally became involved when determining how to handle individuals whose behaviour raised concerns about safety or property. In certain cases, people judged unable to manage their own affairs could be placed under guardianship or supervision. Bethlem sometimes served as a location where such individuals could live while arrangements were made for their care. This connection between the hospital and civic authorities would become more important in later centuries as the institution grew larger. The environment inside the hospital remained relatively simple during the 15th century. Buildings were functional rather than grand. Rooms were shared, and space was limited. Attendants performed many different tasks throughout the day. They distributed food, maintained cleanliness, and monitored residents' activities. Their experience with managing difficult behaviour gradually became an important skill within the institution. Because the number of patients remained small, relationships between attendants and residents could be relatively personal. Staff members observed individuals closely and learned to recognise patterns in their behaviour. Even so, treatment options remained limited. There were no specialised therapies designed specifically for mental illness. Instead, care focused on maintaining stability and preventing harm. Bethlem's identity continued evolving through this gradual process. The hospital still carried the religious name of St. Mary of Bethlehem, reflecting its origins as a charitable foundation. Yet in practice, it was increasingly known as a place where people with troubled minds lived under supervision. This shift marked an important step in the long history of mental health care in England. It represented one of the earliest examples of an institution gradually becoming dedicated to the management of mental disturbance. By the end of the 15th century, Bethlem had established a quiet but distinctive role within London's social structure. Families, clergy, and city officials understood that the hospital offered a place where individuals experiencing severe confusion or agitation could be cared for within a controlled environment. Although medical knowledge remained limited, the institution provided something valuable: a stable location where supervision and shelter could be maintained over long periods of time. In the centuries that followed, the number of such residents would increase, and the hospital's reputation would spread far beyond the city. But during this early stage of its development, Bethlem remained a modest institution working within the boundaries of medieval knowledge and belief. Its attendants carried out their duties according to routines shaped by religion, charity, and practical necessity, and within its walls lived individuals whose experiences reflected a mystery that society was only beginning to examine with curiosity and concern. When Bethlem became an asylum, as the 15th century drew to a close, the institution known as St. Mary of Bethlehem was no longer simply a small charitable hospital among many others in London. Its identity had slowly shifted. Over many decades, the number of residents described as mentally disturbed had grown, and the hospital was increasingly associated with the care of those whose behaviour puzzled or troubled the communities around them. This transformation did not occur through a single decision. Instead, it emerged gradually through practical necessity. Medieval towns had very few structured ways of supporting individuals who experienced severe confusion, unpredictable moods, or unusual patterns of speech and behaviour. Families often attempted to manage these situations at home, but crowded living conditions and economic pressures sometimes made that difficult. When relatives could no longer provide adequate supervision, the responsibility often passed to local authorities or charitable institutions. Bethlem was one of the few places in London that could accept such individuals and maintain a controlled environment. By the early 16th century, the hospital had begun to function more clearly as a place dedicated to mental disturbance. Records from the period increasingly described residents using words that indicated states of mental imbalance. Terms such as lunatic, distracted, or mad appeared in official documents. These labels did not reflect precise medical diagnoses. They were general descriptions used by administrators and caretakers to explain behaviour that appeared unusual or difficult to manage. Within the hospital walls, attendants adapted their routines to accommodate residents whose conditions required close observation. Some individuals remained quiet and withdrawn for long periods, showing little interest in conversation or activity. Others experienced moments of agitation that made constant supervision necessary. To maintain safety, the hospital used physical restraints when attendants believed they were needed. Chains or straps could limit movement if someone attempted to harm themselves or others. While modern readers might see these methods as harsh, they reflected the limited tools available in an era without modern psychiatric understanding. The staff at Bethlem still consisted primarily of caretakers rather than physicians. Their responsibilities included feeding residents, maintaining order within the wards, and ensuring that daily routines continued without disruption. Medical professionals occasionally visited the hospital, but they were not permanently stationed there. Physicians during this period continued to rely on the humoral theory that had guided European medicine for centuries. Treatments aimed at restoring balance in the body might include dietary changes, herbal preparations, or procedures such as bloodletting. These interventions were sometimes attempted for residents believed to be suffering from mental disturbance. However, the results were uncertain, and many individuals simply remained under supervision for long periods without clear improvement. While life inside the hospital followed predictable routines, the world outside Bethlem was changing rapidly. England was entering the Tudor period, an era marked by political centralisation and expanding royal authority. London grew steadily as trade increased and the city's population expanded. Markets grew busier, craftsmen established workshops along narrow streets, and the River Thames carried ships arriving from across Europe. With growth came greater visibility for institutions that addressed social challenges. Hospitals, poorhouses, and other charitable foundations became part of the city's administrative landscape. Bethlem's reputation slowly spread among Londoners. People living near the hospital were aware that individuals with unusual behaviour lived inside its walls. Stories about residents sometimes circulated through the surrounding neighbourhoods. The hospital itself remained relatively small, but its symbolic role began to grow larger. Bethlem represented a place where society placed individuals whose minds no longer seemed to follow ordinary patterns. During the 16th century, another important development influenced institutions across England. The English Reformation, initiated during the reign of King Henry VIII, brought major changes to the relationship between church and state. Many religious institutions were dissolved or reorganised during this period. Monasteries and charitable foundations connected to the Catholic Church lost their traditional structures. Bethlem also experienced administrative changes as part of this broader transformation. The hospital gradually moved away from direct monastic oversight and came under civic control associated with the City of London. This shift meant that city officials became more directly responsible for managing the institution. Administrators began keeping more detailed records, monitoring finances, and supervising staff. The hospital's charitable mission continued, but it now operated within a civic framework rather than a strictly religious one. This transition had practical consequences for how the institution functioned. City authorities viewed Bethlem not only as a charitable refuge, but also as a way to manage social order within the growing urban population. Individuals whose behaviour disrupted households or neighbourhoods could be placed within the hospital where supervision was possible. As London expanded, this role became increasingly significant. The physical environment inside Bethlem remained modest during this period. The buildings were functional rather than grand, and space was often limited. Shared sleeping areas remained common, and residents spent much of their time within enclosed wards. Attendants organised daily routines carefully. Meals occurred at consistent hours. Residents were observed during waking periods and encouraged to rest during the night. Because many individuals experienced periods of agitation or confusion, maintaining order required constant attention. Staff members learned to recognise patterns in behaviour and intervened when necessary. Some residents stayed at Bethlem for extended periods of time. Without effective treatments, their conditions remained largely unchanged. Others, might eventually return to families or communities if their behaviour improved. The hospital did not yet operate as a formal medical institution focused on curing illness. Instead, it functioned as a place of containment and supervision. Yet, even within this limited framework, the idea of mental illness slowly began attracting greater attention. Scholars, physicians, and writers across Europe were beginning to examine the human mind with increasing curiosity. Renaissance thought encouraged new interest in human behaviour, psychology, and the relationship between body and intellect. Although these ideas developed gradually, they would eventually influence how institutions like Bethlem approached the care of residents. For now, however, daily life inside the hospital remained shaped by practical routines rather than theoretical debate. Attendants distributed meals, cleaned living spaces, and monitored behaviour. City officials oversaw finances and administration. Residents passed their days within the structured environment created by these routines. Outside the hospital, London continued evolving into a larger and more complex city. Merchants negotiated business in busy markets, ships unloaded cargo along the Thames, and the sounds of work and conversation filled the narrow streets. Within this growing urban world, Bethlem had established a distinctive role. It had become a place where individuals experiencing severe confusion, distress, or unusual behaviour could be cared for under supervision. Over time, that role would expand. The hospital's reputation would spread further through London society, eventually attracting attention from visitors who came not only out of concern, but also curiosity. But during this stage of its history, Bethlem was still primarily an institution shaped by necessity. Its staff worked with limited knowledge and simple tools. Its residents lived within routines designed to maintain stability, and slowly, the hospital that had begun as a small charitable refuge was taking on a new identity, one that would define its place in English history for centuries to come. Life inside the medieval wards. As Bethlem gradually became known as a place for individuals with troubled minds, daily life inside the hospital developed routines that reflected both practical needs and the limited understanding of mental illness during the late medieval and early Tudor periods. The institution remained small, but the presence of residents whose behaviour required careful supervision shaped how the hospital operated from morning to night. The wards themselves were simple rooms designed for shared living rather than privacy. Most residents slept in communal spaces where beds or straw-filled mattresses were arranged close together. Wooden frames supported the bedding, and blankets were often coarse and functional rather than comfortable. Windows were small and sometimes covered with bars or wooden shutters, allowing light and air while also preventing residents from climbing out. Heating was limited. During colder months, fires burned in designated hearths, but warmth rarely reached every corner of the building. London's damp climate made the interior air heavy, especially during winter when doors and shutters remained closed to protect against the wind. Residents usually rose early in the morning. The day began according to rhythms that had long been common in religious institutions. Bells or verbal calls from attendants signalled the beginning of activity. Those who were able to move freely gathered for simple morning routines before the first meal of the day. Food served in Bethlem reflected the modest resources available to the hospital. Bread remained the main staple. Thick slices were distributed alongside broth or porridge made from grains such as oats or barley. Vegetables like cabbage, onions or peas appeared regularly in the diet. When supplies allowed, small portions of meat might be included, particularly during certain seasons or after charitable donations from the city. Meals were not elaborate, but they were structured. Attendants ensured that food was distributed fairly and that residents remained seated while eating. For individuals experiencing agitation or confusion, the presence of routine helped maintain stability. Water was commonly consumed, though ale or weak beer was sometimes provided as well. In medieval England, lightly fermented beverages were often considered safer to drink than untreated water from wells or rivers. After the morning meal, the hospital entered the main activity period of the day. For some residents, this meant quiet movement within the ward or the small courtyard areas connected to the building. Walking, sitting outdoors when weather allowed, or performing small tasks helped pass the hours. Attendants sometimes encouraged simple activities that required minimal skill. Folding cloth, sweeping floors, or assisting with minor household duties allowed residents to remain occupied. These tasks were not part of formal therapy, but caretakers believed that structured activity could support calm behaviour. Other residents required more supervision. Some individuals experienced confusion that made it difficult to follow instructions or remain within designated spaces. In such cases, attendants stayed nearby to guide movement and prevent accidents. Restraints were used selectively when staff believed someone posed a danger to themselves or others. Chains attached to walls or heavy furniture limited movement if agitation became severe. Leather straps or other binding devices could also be used to secure arms or legs temporarily. These methods were not unique to Bethlem. Similar approaches were used in many medieval institutions responsible for supervising individuals with unpredictable behaviour. Staff members had few alternatives available, and their primary goal was maintaining safety within a crowded environment. During quieter moments of the day, residents sometimes rested in their sleeping areas or sat along the walls of the ward. Conversations between patients occurred occasionally, though many individuals struggled to communicate clearly due to the nature of their conditions. Attendants observed these interactions carefully. They watched for signs that someone might become distressed or aggressive, intervening when necessary to prevent conflict. Midday meals followed patterns similar to breakfast, but were often slightly more substantial. Stews or thicker broths might be served along with bread. When supplies permitted, fish or preserved meat appeared in the kitchen's preparations. The hospital relied heavily on donations to sustain its food supply. Wealthy citizens sometimes provided money or provisions as part of their charitable obligations. Religious festivals also brought occasional gifts from benefactors who wished to support the hospital's mission. In the afternoon hours, activity often slowed. Residents who had spent time walking or performing tasks returned to resting spaces. Some lay quietly on bedding while others sat along the walls observing the surroundings. Because Bethlem's population remained small during these early centuries, attendants often knew the behaviour patterns of individual residents. They recognised which patients required constant observation and which could move more freely within the building. Evening meals occurred before darkness settled across the city. Afterward, preparations for nighttime began. Candles or oil lamps provided limited lighting inside the wards, but attendants encouraged residents to rest once the day's routines were completed. Nighttime supervision remained important. Some individuals experienced restless behaviour after dark, pacing the ward or speaking aloud without clear direction. Attendants remained awake in shifts to monitor the building and respond if someone required assistance. Outside the hospital, London's streets gradually quieted during these hours. Market stalls closed, workshops finished their labour, and most households settled into evening routines. Within Bethlem, however, the night could still contain moments of activity. The mixture of personalities and conditions among residents meant that silence was not always possible. Attendants responded patiently, guiding individuals back toward their sleeping areas when necessary. The physical design of the hospital reflected the need for constant supervision. Doors were strong and secured with heavy locks. Windows were narrow and positioned high enough to prevent easy escape. These features allowed staff to maintain control of the environment, even with limited personnel. Although medical treatments were rare, physicians sometimes visited Bethlem when administrators believed a patient might benefit from examination. These visits were infrequent, but they represented early attempts to apply learned medical theory to conditions that were still poorly understood. Physicians might ask attendants questions about a patient's behaviour or examine physical symptoms before recommending treatments aimed at restoring humoral balance. Such advice might include dietary adjustments or herbal mixtures prepared by apothecaries. Results varied, and many patients remained in the hospital without significant change in their condition. Even so, these early medical efforts showed that society was beginning to approach mental disturbance as a problem that might eventually be studied and understood. For the residents themselves, life inside Bethlem was defined by routine rather than progress toward recovery. Days followed similar patterns, and many individuals remained within the institution for long periods. Some patients eventually left the hospital when their families requested their return, or when administrators believed supervision was no longer required. Others remained indefinitely if their behaviour continued to present challenges outside the hospital environment. The experience of living inside Bethlem therefore differed widely from one person to another. Some residents may have found a measure of stability within its structured routines. Others likely experienced the hospital as a place of confinement where daily life offered little variation. Despite these limitations, the hospital fulfilled a function that medieval society considered necessary. It provided a controlled environment where individuals whose minds troubled them could receive supervision and basic care. As London continued expanding during the Tudor period, this role would become increasingly important. The city's population would grow larger, and social institutions would need to adapt to new pressures. Bethlem, with its established routines and experienced attendants, would gradually move further toward becoming a dedicated asylum. The transformation was still incomplete during these early years, but the foundations had already been laid within the quiet wards where residents lived under the watchful eyes of caretakers. London grows around the hospital. During the 16th century, the city surrounding Bethlem began changing at a steady and noticeable pace. London had always been an important trading centre, but under the Tudor monarchs it expanded into a much larger and more active capital. Streets that had once held small clusters of timber houses gradually filled with workshops, markets, and new neighbourhoods. Merchants, labourers, and travellers moved through the city in growing numbers. Bethlem remained located just outside the old city walls for much of this period. When it had first been founded in the 13th century, that position meant the hospital stood on the edge of the town, close enough to serve the population but separated from the busiest streets. Over the centuries that followed, however, London gradually spread outward. Fields and open spaces near the hospital slowly gave way to houses and narrow lanes. The growing population of the city meant that the area around Bethlem became more active than it had once been. Traders and craftsmen passed along nearby roads, and new communities formed around what had previously been quiet ground. As London expanded, institutions like Bethlem became more visible parts of the urban landscape. People who lived or worked near the hospital could see attendants entering and leaving the gates, or hear the sounds of activity within the walls. Although the hospital population remained small, its presence was increasingly recognised by the surrounding community. At the same time, the city's administration became more organised. The City of London was governed by officials responsible for maintaining order, managing public resources, and overseeing institutions that served the population. Hospitals, poorhouses, and charitable foundations gradually came under closer civic supervision. Bethlem was among these institutions. During the 16th century, it operated under the authority of city officials connected with other hospitals, including larger charitable establishments that cared for the sick poor. This administrative network allowed London to coordinate support for vulnerable groups within the population. Because Bethlem had developed experience caring for individuals with disturbed behaviour, city authorities continued directing certain cases there. When families could not manage a relative whose mental condition caused confusion or agitation, the hospital offered a controlled setting where supervision was possible. This role made Bethlem increasingly important within London's system of social management. The Tudor period also brought significant political changes to England. The reign of Henry VIII had reshaped the relationship between church and state through the English Reformation. Monasteries that had once played a central role in charitable care were dissolved, and many religious properties passed into secular control. As a result, civic authorities assumed greater responsibility for institutions that had previously operated within religious networks. Bethlem continued functioning as a charitable hospital, but its administration now reflected the city's growing involvement in public welfare. Records from the 16th century suggest that the hospital maintained only a small number of residents at any given time. Estimates indicate that perhaps 20 patients or fewer lived there during some periods. Even so, the institution's reputation continued spreading through the city. Londoners gradually began associating Bethlem with the idea of madness. Stories about individuals who behaved in unusual ways, circulated easily through markets and taverns. When people described someone acting in a confused or erratic manner, they sometimes referred to Bethlem as the place where such individuals might be sent. The hospital's name slowly entered everyday speech. Over time, the word Bethlem began changing in pronunciation. Many Londoners shortened it to Bedlam, a simpler form that rolled more easily from the tongue. This shift in language happened gradually and informally. It reflected the natural way spoken words evolve within busy urban communities. Yet the new pronunciation would eventually become famous far beyond the city. Inside the hospital, daily routines continued much as they had in previous centuries. Attendants supervised residents throughout the day, distributing food, maintaining order, and ensuring that individuals remained within the wards or courtyard areas. The physical buildings of Bethlem were aging by this time. Constructed long before London's population boom, the hospital structures had not been designed for heavy use across many centuries. Repairs were often required to maintain the facility. City authorities occasionally provided funds for maintenance, though resources were limited. The hospital relied on donations and charitable contributions to supplement official support. Despite these financial constraints, the institution remained functional. Staff members performed their duties with the practical focus required to manage a small but complex population. The surrounding neighbourhood grew increasingly active during the latter part of the 16th century. Roads leading toward the city gates carried merchants transporting goods to markets within London. Craftsmen established workshops nearby, producing items such as leather goods, cloth, or metal tools. Residents of these neighbourhoods became familiar with the hospital's presence. For some, Bethlem simply formed part of the local environment. Others regarded it with curiosity, wondering about the people who lived behind its walls. Occasionally, individuals passing along nearby streets could hear voices or sounds coming from the wards. Because mental disturbance sometimes produced loud or unpredictable behaviour, these noises could attract attention from those outside. Such moments reinforced the growing association between Bethlem and the concept of madness. Yet the hospital still operated quietly, compared with the notoriety it would develop in later centuries. Visitors from the public were not yet a regular presence, and the institution remained focused primarily on providing supervision for its residents. As the 17th century approached, however, London itself was becoming one of the largest cities in Europe. Population estimates suggest that the number of inhabitants rose dramatically during the late Tudor and early Stuart periods. Crowded streets, busy markets, and expanding trade networks created an energetic urban environment unlike the quieter medieval town of earlier centuries. This growth placed new pressures on social institutions. Authorities needed ways to address poverty, illness, and behavioural disturbances within a population that was larger and more diverse than ever before. Bethlem continued serving as one of the city's solutions to these challenges. Individuals whose behaviour caused concern within their communities were sometimes brought to the hospital by relatives or city officials. Once admitted, they joined the small group of residents already living within the wards. Attendants maintained the routines that had proven effective in managing daily life. Meals were distributed, sleeping arrangements supervised, and any disturbances addressed quickly to prevent conflict. Although the hospital still lacked advanced medical knowledge, its experience handling such cases gave it a unique role within London. Meanwhile, changes in intellectual life across Europe were beginning to influence how scholars and physicians thought about the human mind. Renaissance learning encouraged renewed interest in classical philosophy and medicine, including ancient discussions about emotion, reason, and mental balance. These ideas would eventually shape new approaches to mental health care. For now, however, Bethlem continued operating according to the practical traditions it had developed over centuries. Its attendants relied on routine, supervision, and physical control when necessary. Its administrators managed finances and admissions within the framework established by the city. Outside the hospital gates, London moved steadily forward into a new era of growth and complexity. The presence of Bethlem within that changing city ensured that the institution would remain closely connected to the broader story of English society. and as the population continued to expand, the hospital's reputation would soon spread even further, attracting attention from people whose curiosity about the lives of its residents would transform Bethlem into something quite different from the quiet, charitable refuge it had once been. Visitors at the gates. As the 17th century began, London had become one of the most active cities in Europe. Its population had grown rapidly during the late Tudor and early Stuart periods, bringing merchants, craftsmen, sailors and travellers into the crowded streets. Markets filled the air with noise and movement, and new neighbourhoods spread outward from the old city walls. Within this expanding urban environment, Bethlem Royal Hospital became increasingly visible. For centuries it had existed quietly on the edges of London life, but now more people were aware of the institution and the unusual residents who lived inside its wards. Curiosity played a powerful role in shaping how Londoners viewed the hospital. Mental disturbance remained poorly understood, and behaviour that appeared strange or unpredictable often attracted attention. When people heard that Bethlem housed individuals who spoke to unseen figures, laughed without reason, or paced endlessly through the wards, many felt a mixture of fascination and uncertainty. Gradually, a new custom began to appear. Members of the public started visiting the hospital to observe the patients. This practice developed slowly rather than through formal planning. At first, visitors were likely acquaintances of administrators or people with connections to the institution. Over time, however, the idea spread more widely through the city. Bethlem began allowing certain visitors to enter and walk through the wards under supervision. These visits were sometimes treated as charitable tours. Donations made by visitors helped support the hospital's expenses, which were often difficult to manage with limited civic funding. Contributions from the public provided additional resources for food, repairs and supplies. Yet the visits also reflected a deeper cultural curiosity about madness. For many Londoners, the hospital represented a place where behaviour that seemed mysterious or unsettling could be observed at close range. People who had only heard stories about mental disturbance now had the opportunity to see patients directly. Groups of visitors might walk slowly through the wards while attendants watched carefully. The patients themselves responded in different ways. Some paid little attention to the presence of outsiders, continuing their own quiet routines. Others reacted with agitation, speaking loudly or moving restlessly when strangers appeared. Attendants maintained order during these visits, guiding guests along designated paths and preventing interference with the daily management of the hospital. For residents, the experience could be confusing. Individuals already struggling with disturbed thoughts sometimes found themselves watched by curious observers. The hospital staff attempted to keep these visits brief and controlled, but the atmosphere inside the wards could still change noticeably when outsiders entered. From the perspective of the city's administrators, however, the practice served several purposes. Public visits provided a source of financial support through donations. They also reinforced the idea that Bethlem was fulfilling an important civic role. By caring for individuals whose behaviour challenged social expectations, the hospital contributed to maintaining order within the wider community. The growing number of visitors also increased Bethlem's reputation throughout London. Writers and observers occasionally described the hospital in pamphlets or travel accounts. These descriptions often focused on the unusual behaviour of the patients rather than the everyday routines of the institution. Such reports circulated widely, helping establish Bethlem as a symbol of madness in English culture. During the early 17th century, the pronunciation of the hospital's name continued evolving in everyday speech. Many Londoners referred to the institution simply as Bedlam, a shortened form that had gradually replaced the original pronunciation of Bethlem. The word began appearing in written texts as well. Writers used Bedlam to describe scenes of confusion or disorder, drawing on the hospital's reputation as a place where reason seemed to collapse. This linguistic shift marked an important moment in the cultural history of the institution. Bethlem was no longer just the name of a hospital. It had become a symbol within the language itself. Meanwhile, life inside the hospital continued following the routines established by its attendants. Residents rose in the morning, ate simple meals, and spent their days under supervision within the wards or small outdoor areas attached to the building. Staff members monitored behaviour carefully, intervening when agitation or conflict appeared likely. The presence of visitors added a new element to this daily rhythm. Attendants had to manage both the residents and the curious observers who arrived at the gates. Not all visitors came purely for entertainment. Some individuals approached the hospital with genuine concern about the treatment of the patients. Others were interested in the growing discussions about the nature of the human mind that were emerging among scholars and physicians. The 17th century saw increasing intellectual interest in psychology and human behaviour. Philosophers began exploring questions about consciousness, reason, and emotion in ways that had not been common in earlier centuries. Although these ideas had not yet produced new medical treatments, they encouraged closer observation of mental disturbance as a subject worthy of study. Bethlem's patients, therefore, sometimes attracted the attention of individuals who wished to understand these conditions more clearly. However, the hospital was still far from becoming a centre of scientific research. Most visits remained informal and brief. Observers saw only glimpses of life within the wards before leaving again for the busy streets of London. The physical condition of the hospital buildings also continued to decline during this period. The original medieval structures had endured centuries of use and weather. Repairs became more frequent as the population of residents slowly increased. City officials occasionally discussed the need for improvements or relocation. The growing importance of the institution within London's system of social management made its condition a matter of practical concern. At the same time, the surrounding city continued expanding rapidly. Trade brought wealth to many London merchants, and the population surged as people moved into the capital seeking opportunity. New neighbourhoods developed beyond the old walls, and traffic along the roads near Bethlem grew heavier each year. This expansion meant that the hospital was no longer isolated on the outskirts of the city. Instead, it found itself increasingly surrounded by urban life. The presence of curious visitors, growing population pressures, and ageing buildings all suggested that Bethlem was entering a new phase of its history. The institution that had once been a quiet, charitable refuge now occupied a prominent place in the cultural imagination of London. People spoke its name when describing confusion or disorder. Visitors arrived at its gates to observe the residents whose behaviour seemed to defy ordinary explanation. Yet behind this growing reputation, the daily life of the hospital remained grounded in simple routines. Attendants continued their work of supervision and care. Residents followed the patterns of meals, rest, and observation that structured their days. And as the 17th century progressed, the pressures created by London's rapid expansion would soon lead to one of the most significant changes in the hospital's long history. Plans would soon emerge to rebuild the institution in a new location, one that would give Bethlem a grander physical presence and a more visible role within the city. The chaos of the 1600s. As the 17th century advanced, England entered a period of political and social upheaval that affected nearly every institution in the country. Bethlem Royal Hospital was no exception. While daily routines inside the hospital remained structured and familiar, the world beyond its walls was experiencing rapid and sometimes unsettling change. London itself had grown into one of Europe's largest cities. By the early 1600s, its population had reached well over 200,000 people. Streets were crowded with carts, livestock, and pedestrians moving through narrow lanes lined with timber houses. Markets bustled with merchants selling cloth, grain, fish, and imported goods arriving from overseas trade. This expanding city created new pressures on public institutions responsible for managing social problems. Poverty, illness, and displacement were common features of urban life. Individuals who struggled with mental disturbance were often among the most vulnerable members of the population. Bethlem therefore continued receiving residents brought by relatives, parish officials, or city authorities. As London grew, the number of such cases slowly increased. The hospital's ageing medieval buildings, however, were not well suited for accommodating a rising population of patients. Rooms designed centuries earlier for a small charitable community now held more residents than originally intended. Overcrowding gradually became a concern. Shared wards meant that individuals with very different conditions lived close together. Some patients remained quiet and withdrawn, while others experienced agitation or confusion that disturbed those around them. Attendants worked constantly to maintain order within the confined spaces. They monitored movement through the wards, separated residents when conflict appeared likely, and used restraints when someone became too difficult to manage safely. These challenges were intensified by the broader instability affecting England during the mid-17th century. The country entered a period of political conflict that eventually led to the English Civil War. Tensions between King Charles I and Parliament divided the nation, leading to armed conflict beginning in the 1640s. Although Bethlem was not directly involved in the fighting, the war disrupted the financial and administrative structures that supported many institutions. Economic uncertainty made charitable donations less predictable. Civic authorities faced competing demands on their resources. Hospitals like Bethlem had to continue operating despite these difficulties. Administrators struggled to maintain the building and supply food for residents. Repairs to aging walls and roofs were often delayed because funds were limited. Yet the hospital remained open, continuing its role within London's social system. Life inside Bethlem during these years reflected a mixture of routine and tension. Attendants still organised the day around meals, supervision and rest, but the crowded environment made their tasks more demanding. The presence of visitors also continued during this period. Londoners who had heard stories about Bedlam sometimes came to see the hospital's residents for themselves. These visits added another layer of complexity to the work of the staff. While some visitors approached with curiosity or sympathy, others treated the experience as a form of entertainment. Observing individuals whose behaviour appeared strange or unpredictable became an unusual attraction within the city. Attendants attempted to manage these visits carefully. Guests were escorted through designated areas, and staff ensured that interactions remained brief. Even so, the presence of observers could sometimes agitate residents who were already struggling with confusion or distress. Meanwhile, the intellectual climate of the 17th century was beginning to change. Scholars across Europe were exploring new approaches to science, philosophy, and medicine. The early stages of what historians now call the scientific revolution encouraged greater attention to observation and evidence. Physicians gradually began examining mental disturbance with more systematic curiosity. Rather than relying solely on traditional explanations rooted in humoral imbalance or spiritual interpretation, some thinkers asked whether careful study of behaviour might reveal patterns that could guide treatment. These ideas were still developing, and they had not yet transformed the practices used inside institutions like Bethlem. However, they marked the beginning of a slow shift in how educated observers thought about the human mind. The hospital itself remained focused on supervision rather than research or treatment. Most residents lived within the wards for extended periods without any clear expectation of recovery. Yet administrators recognized that the institution's physical condition was becoming increasingly inadequate. The medieval buildings were deteriorating. Years of heavy use, combined with limited maintenance during the turbulent decades of the Civil War and its aftermath, left the hospital in poor repair. Walls cracked, roofs leaked, and living spaces grew more crowded as additional residents arrived. City officials began discussing the possibility of relocating the hospital to a new building better suited to its expanding role. Such discussions reflected broader changes taking place in London. After the political conflicts of the mid-17th century subsided, the city entered a new phase of development. One of the most dramatic events shaping this period occurred in 1666, when the Great Fire of London destroyed large sections of the city. The fire began in a bakery on Pudding Lane and spread rapidly through the tightly packed wooden houses. Over the course of several days, flames consumed thousands of buildings, including homes, churches, and businesses. Although Bethlem itself was not destroyed by the fire, the disaster transformed the city's landscape. Reconstruction efforts introduced new architectural plans and encouraged officials to rethink how important institutions should be designed. The rebuilding of London created opportunities for modernisation. Wider streets, stronger building materials, and improved urban planning gradually replaced the older medieval structures. Within this atmosphere of reconstruction, the idea of creating a new home for Bethlem gained momentum. City authorities recognized that the hospital had outgrown its original site. A larger building would allow administrators to manage residents more effectively and provide improved living conditions. Planning for such a move required careful organization and financial support. Donations from wealthy patrons, along with civic funding, would be necessary to construct a new facility. As these plans began forming toward the end of the 17th century, Bethlem stood at an important turning point. The institution had survived centuries of gradual transformation. It had evolved from a small religious hospital into a place widely known for housing individuals with disturbed minds. Its name had entered everyday language as a symbol of disorder. Yet the hospital itself was preparing for a physical rebirth. The aging medieval buildings would soon give way to a new structure designed to represent authority, control, and order within a rapidly changing city. For the residents and attendants who continued their daily routines inside the old wards, this transformation was only beginning to take shape. But the next chapter of Bethlem's history would soon unfold in a new location, one that would give the hospital a striking architectural presence and further cement its place in the story of London: the Moorfields rebuilding. By the latter decades of the 17th century, it had become clear to London's civic authorities that Bethlem Royal Hospital could no longer remain in its aging medieval buildings. The institution had outgrown its original structure, and its role within the city had expanded far beyond what the founders in the 13th century had ever imagined. Administrators and city officials began discussing plans for a completely new hospital, one that would provide more space, stronger buildings, and a clearer sense of order. The decision reflected the practical needs of the institution, but it also revealed something about how the city wanted Bethlem to appear. A hospital that housed individuals with troubled minds needed to be secure and organized. At the same time, the new building was expected to demonstrate civic pride and authority. The design would therefore be far more ambitious than the modest medieval structure it replaced. The chosen location for the new hospital was Moorfields, an open area north of the old city walls. Moorfields had long been known as a place where Londoners walked, gathered, or attended public events. It was less crowded than the narrow streets of the city centre and offered space large enough to construct an impressive building. Construction began during the 1670s, and the project soon attracted considerable attention. The design of the new Bethlem was influenced by contemporary architectural ideas that favoured symmetry and grandeur. The building stretched across a wide facade, with orderly rows of windows and strong stone walls. The length of the structure itself made a powerful visual impression. Visitors approaching Moorfields could see the hospital standing prominently against the skyline, its long shape emphasising both scale and authority. At the entrance stood sculpted figures representing what artists believed madness looked like. These statues were placed deliberately to symbolise the nature of the institution. One figure appeared restrained by chains, while another displayed exaggerated expressions associated with emotional disturbance. Such imagery reflected the period's understanding of mental illness. The sculptures were intended to communicate that the hospital was a place where disorder of the mind was contained and controlled. Inside the building, the layout was far more organised than the old medieval wards. Long corridors ran through the structure, with individual rooms arranged along each side. These rooms allowed attendants to separate residents more effectively than before. In the earlier hospital, patients had often slept in shared spaces. The new design made it easier to isolate individuals whose behaviour required special supervision. Windows were placed high in the walls to allow light and ventilation, while preventing residents from climbing out. Iron bars reinforced many of these openings, reflecting the continued emphasis on security. The hospital also included outdoor spaces where residents could be escorted for fresh air. These courtyards were enclosed to ensure that patients remained within the boundaries of the institution. For the administrators of Bethlem, the Moorfields building represented progress. It provided a more orderly environment where residents could be supervised more effectively. The improved structure also symbolized the city's commitment to managing social problems within organized institutions. When the new hospital opened, residents were gradually transferred from the old site into the Moorfields building. The move marked one of the most significant changes in the institution's long history. Attendants had to adapt their routines to the new environment. The larger building meant longer corridors to supervise and more rooms to monitor. However, the improved layout also allowed staff to separate patients more efficiently according to their behaviour. Some residents occupied single rooms where attendants could observe them through small openings in the doors. Others shared spaces if their conditions allowed them to remain calm in the presence of companions. Daily life continued following familiar patterns. Meals were distributed at regular intervals, and residents spent time walking in enclosed outdoor areas when weather permitted. Attendants maintained close watch over movement throughout the building. Despite these improvements, the hospital's purpose remained focused primarily on supervision rather than treatment. Physicians occasionally visited to examine patients, but the majority of care still involved maintaining order within the institution. The new building also attracted even greater attention from the public. Because Moorfields was a well-known gathering place in London, many people passing through the area could easily see the impressive structure of the hospital. Visitors who had heard stories about Bedlam now found it easier to approach the institution and request entry. As a result, public visits became more frequent. Groups of curious Londoners sometimes arrived, hoping to observe the residents inside. Administrators allowed certain tours to continue, partly because the donations collected from visitors helped support the hospital's expenses. This practice reinforced Bethlem's unusual place within the city's culture. Unlike most medical institutions, it had become a destination where members of the public could observe individuals experiencing mental disturbance. For some visitors, the experience was educational or thought-provoking. Others approached it with a more casual curiosity. Attendants remained responsible for ensuring that visitors did not interfere with daily routines. Guests were guided through the corridors briefly before leaving the building. Meanwhile, the word Bedlam continued spreading through English language and literature. Writers used the term to describe scenes of confusion or disorder, drawing on the reputation of the hospital. The association between the institution and the idea of chaos became deeply embedded in popular culture. Yet the physical reality inside the hospital was less dramatic than these descriptions suggested. Life in the wards followed structured routines governed by attendants who worked to keep the environment stable. Residents experienced long days shaped by predictable schedules. Some remained quiet and withdrawn, while others required careful supervision when agitation appeared. The Moorfields building did not solve every challenge faced by the hospital. Overcrowding would eventually return as the population of London continued increasing. Still, the new structure represented an important milestone. It demonstrated that the city recognized the importance of institutions dedicated to managing mental disturbance. Bethlem now stood not only as a charitable refuge, but also as a visible symbol of how society addressed the mysteries of the human mind. The grand building at Moorfields would remain the hospital's home for more than a century. During that time, Bethlem's reputation would continue growing, and the curious crowds that visited its corridors would become a defining feature of its history. Inside the hospital, however, the work of attendants continued quietly. They walked the long halls, checked the locked doors, and ensured that daily life remained orderly, a house of curious entertainment. The new Bethlem Hospital at Moorfields quickly became one of the most recognisable buildings in the northern part of London. Its long symmetrical facade, its rows of windows, and the sculpted figures above its entrance drew attention from people walking across the open grounds nearby. For residents of the city, the building represented more than simply a hospital. It had become a place associated with curiosity. The practice of visiting Bethlem to observe patients grew more common during the late 17th century and continued into the early 18th century. Visitors approached the gates not only out of concern or charitable interest, but also because they had heard stories about the unusual behaviour inside. London during this period was full of public spectacles. Markets, theatres, fairs and exhibitions provided entertainment for a growing urban population. Within that culture of observation, Bethlem occupied a strange position. It was not designed as a place of entertainment, yet the opportunity to see individuals experiencing extreme mental distress drew the attention of many people. The hospital's administrators were aware that public visits could help support the institution financially. Donations from visitors were accepted and often encouraged. These contributions helped cover expenses for food, repairs, and staff wages. Because of this financial support, controlled visits continued to be allowed. Visitors typically entered under supervision. Attendants guided small groups along certain corridors while ensuring that the routines of the hospital were not completely interrupted. The tours were brief, but they allowed observers to see patients within the wards. For many people, the experience was unfamiliar and difficult to interpret. Mental disturbance often produced behaviours that seemed unpredictable to those who had never encountered such conditions before. Some patients moved restlessly through their rooms. Others spoke aloud to themselves or laughed without obvious cause. There were also individuals who appeared quiet and withdrawn, sitting silently in corners or lying on their beds without engaging with those around them. Visitors reacted in different ways. Some watched with sympathy, recognizing the suffering that the patients experienced. Others approached the visit with a sense of fascination, discussing what they had seen as they left the building. The hospital staff attempted to maintain order during these tours. Attendants reminded visitors not to provoke or mock the residents. However, the atmosphere sometimes became uncomfortable for patients who realized they were being watched. Despite these difficulties, the practice continued for many decades. The growing reputation of Bethlem made it one of the most talked-about institutions in London. Writers, travellers, and pamphleteers described their visits in printed accounts that circulated widely throughout England. Some authors use Bethlem as a symbol when discussing the boundaries between reason and confusion. They describe the hospital as a place where the normal patterns of thought seem to collapse, creating a visible contrast between ordinary life and mental disturbance. The word Bedlam, already common in spoken language, appeared frequently in these writings. Over time, it became firmly established in English vocabulary as a word meaning disorder or chaos. This cultural transformation meant that Bethlem was no longer simply a hospital known to the residents of London. It had become a symbol recognised across the country. Meanwhile, the everyday operation of the hospital continued according to familiar routines. Attendants began their work early each morning, checking the rooms along the long corridors and ensuring that residents were safe. Meals were distributed in simple portions of bread, broth, vegetables, and occasionally meat when supplies allowed. Patients spent much of the day within their assigned rooms or in small outdoor spaces where they could walk under supervision. Staff members monitored behaviour carefully, separating individuals whose conditions made interaction difficult. Restraints were still used when attendants believed they were necessary to prevent injury. Chains or straps could limit movement during periods of agitation, though staff tried to release these restraints when behaviour became calmer. Physicians associated with the hospital occasionally examined patients, applying the medical theories that remained dominant during the early modern period. Treatments aimed at balancing the body's humours continued to guide medical thinking. Such treatments sometimes included bloodletting, purging medicines, or herbal preparations believed to calm agitation or restore emotional stability. These methods reflected the medical knowledge available at the time, though they rarely produced lasting improvement. Because effective treatments were limited, many residents remained in Bethlem for long periods. Some stayed for years, while others moved in and out of the institution depending on their circumstances. The hospital's population therefore changed slowly, with new residents replacing those who left or died. Outside the hospital, London's cultural life continued expanding. Coffee houses became popular meeting places where people discussed politics, literature, and science. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated new ideas across the city. Within these conversations, Bethlem sometimes appeared as a subject of commentary. Writers used the hospital to illustrate debates about human reason, morality, and the responsibilities of society. Some observers began questioning whether public visits to the hospital were appropriate. They argued that watching patients for entertainment risked turning human suffering into spectacle. These criticisms remained relatively limited during the early 18th century, but they represented the beginning of a change in public attitudes. At the same time, intellectual life in Europe was moving toward the ideas that would later be called the Enlightenment. Philosophers and scholars increasingly emphasized reason, observation, and systematic study. This intellectual movement encouraged a more careful examination of social institutions, including hospitals and asylums. Although these ideas did not immediately transform Bethlem's practices, they helped create an atmosphere in which reform would eventually be considered. For the moment, however, the hospital continued functioning much as it had in previous decades. Visitors still arrived at the gates, guided through the corridors by attendants who kept careful watch over both guests and residents. Donations from these visits helped sustain the institution's operations. Inside the wards, patients lived according to routines designed to maintain stability. Some individuals remained quiet and withdrawn, while others experienced episodes of agitation that required closer supervision. The grand building at Moorfields stood as a visible symbol of the institution's role within the city. Its long facade faced the open fields where Londoners gathered for walks and public events. The statues at its entrance reminded visitors that the building housed individuals whose minds did not follow ordinary patterns. Yet behind that imposing exterior, the hospital remained a place defined by routine rather than spectacle. Attendants carried out their duties with steady attention, guiding residents through the predictable rhythm of each day. And as the 18th century progressed, new voices would soon begin asking whether the care provided inside those walls should change. Physicians and early treatments. As the 18th century unfolded, Bethlem Royal Hospital continued operating within the imposing Moorfields building, and the institution gradually attracted more attention from physicians who were interested in the study of mental disturbance. Medicine itself was slowly evolving during this period. While many traditional theories still shaped practice, doctors were beginning to examine human behaviour with greater curiosity and organisation. Medical training in England had long been influenced by the teachings of ancient physicians such as Hippocrates and Galen. Their ideas about the balance of bodily humours remained central to how illness was understood. According to this system, disturbances of the mind could arise when the body's internal balance shifted too far in one direction. Physicians believed that excessive heat, cold, moisture, or dryness within the body could influence emotional stability and reasoning. If these elements fell out of balance, a person might experience sadness, agitation, confusion, or irrational behaviour. These ideas guided the treatments that doctors recommended for patients living inside institutions like Bethlem. One of the most common medical practices was bloodletting. Physicians believed that removing a certain amount of blood could restore equilibrium within the body. The procedure was usually performed using small blades or specialized instruments designed to open a vein. Another method involved purging the body through herbal medicines that caused vomiting or bowel movement. These treatments were intended to remove harmful substances believed to accumulate within the body's humours. Herbal preparations also played a role in early attempts to calm agitated patients. Plants such as valerian, poppy extracts, and other botanical mixtures were sometimes administered in small doses. Physicians believed these remedies might soothe nervous excitement or encourage rest. Bathing treatments occasionally appeared as well. Warm baths were thought to relax the body and restore balance, while cold water was sometimes used in attempts to shock patients out of states of agitation. These methods reflected the limited scientific understanding of mental illness during the early 18th century. Physicians approached the problem with the knowledge available to them, drawing upon traditions that had guided European medicine for centuries. Within Bethlem, however, doctors did not control the institution's daily routines. Attendants remained responsible for supervising patients throughout the day. Their work required patience, observation, and practical judgment. They learned to recognize the behavior patterns of individual residents and adjusted supervision accordingly. Physicians usually visited the hospital only at certain times rather than remaining permanently on site. During these visits, they examined patients who appeared particularly distressed or whose condition had changed noticeably. Doctors asked attendants questions about sleep patterns, appetite, speech and physical health. These observations helped them determine which treatments might be attempted. Although physicians hoped their interventions might restore mental stability, success was uncertain. Many patients showed little improvement after treatment, and some remained within the hospital for many years. Even so, the presence of physicians marked a gradual step toward treating mental disturbance as a medical problem rather than simply a social inconvenience. The 18th century also saw growing interest among scholars in understanding the workings of the human mind. Philosophers wrote extensively about reason, emotion, and perception. Thinkers such as John Locke examined how experience shaped human thought. These discussions encouraged physicians to consider whether mental illness might involve disturbances in the processes of thinking itself. Although such ideas remained theoretical, they helped create an intellectual climate in which closer study of mental conditions seemed worthwhile. Bethlem's reputation meant that it occasionally attracted doctors who wished to observe patients as part of their learning. The hospital provided an opportunity to see a variety of behaviours associated with mental disturbance. Observations made during these visits sometimes appeared in medical writings of the time. Physicians described symptoms they had witnessed and discussed possible explanations based on existing theories. These writings rarely offered effective treatments, but they represented early attempts to document mental illness systematically. Meanwhile, the daily experience of patients inside Bethlem continued following the routines established by attendants. Residents woke early, ate simple meals, and spent much of their time within their assigned rooms or supervised courtyards. Some individuals remained quiet and withdrawn, while others experienced restless movement or loud speech that drew the attention of staff. Attendants intervened when necessary to prevent harm or conflict. Restraints were still used for patients who became aggressive or difficult to control. Chains, straps, or confinement within small rooms limited movement during these episodes. From the perspective of the hospital's administrators, these methods were considered necessary for maintaining safety within a crowded institution. At the same time, the hospital continued receiving visitors from the public. Many Londoners were still curious about the residents whose behaviour seemed so different from ordinary life. Tours through the corridors allowed visitors to observe patients briefly before leaving again for the busy streets of the city. Some physicians criticised this practice, arguing that it distracted from the hospital's purpose as a place of care. Others viewed the visits as a practical source of funding for an institution that struggled with limited resources. Debates about the proper role of Bethlem slowly emerged during this period. Should the hospital focus entirely on caring for patients, or should it continue allowing public access that helped sustain its finances? These questions did not produce immediate changes, but they signalled a growing awareness that the institution's role in society might need reconsideration. Meanwhile, London itself continued growing larger and more complex. Trade connected the city with distant regions, bringing wealth as well as new social challenges. Institutions responsible for managing illness and poverty had to adapt to this expanding population. Bethlem remained one of the few places specifically associated with mental disturbance. As a result, it continued receiving patients whose families or communities could not manage their behaviour elsewhere. The presence of physicians, even in limited numbers, suggested that society was beginning to view these conditions through a medical lens. Although treatments remained primitive by modern standards, the idea that mental illness might require professional study marked an important development. Inside the long corridors of the Moorfields Hospital, the routines of daily life continued. Attendants moved quietly from room to room checking on residents. Physicians visited occasionally to examine patients and recommend treatments rooted in humoral theory. Visitors from the public walked through the building under supervision, contributing donations that helped sustain the institution. Chains, cells, and routine. By the middle of the 18th century, Bethlem Royal Hospital had developed a structured system for supervising its residents. The Moorfields building, with its long corridors and rows of individual rooms, allowed attendants to organise daily life with greater control than had been possible in the earlier medieval hospital. Yet the methods used to maintain order still relied heavily on physical restraint and strict routines. The design of the hospital reflected the priorities of the time. Each side of the building contained a series of rooms that opened onto a central hallway. These rooms were small and simple. A wooden bed frame, straw mattress, blanket, and sometimes a stool or small table made up most of the furnishings. Windows were positioned high in the walls and reinforced with iron bars. This arrangement allowed sunlight to enter while preventing patients from climbing outside. The doors to many rooms included small openings or observation panels through which attendants could monitor residents without entering. Such features were intended to ensure safety and maintain constant supervision. Residents were usually placed in rooms according to their behaviour. Individuals who remained calm and cooperative might share larger spaces or spend time in the hospital's enclosed courtyards. Those who experienced agitation or unpredictable movement were often assigned to individual cells where their activity could be observed more easily. Attendants began their work early each morning by walking through the corridors to check on patients. They ensured that everyone was awake, safe, and ready to begin the day's routine. Breakfast followed shortly afterward. The meal remained simple and consistent with earlier centuries of the hospital's history. Bread formed the main portion, sometimes accompanied by porridge or broth prepared in the kitchen. Vegetables and occasional meat appeared when supplies permitted. After eating, patients were encouraged to move about within the spaces allowed to them. Those who were able to walk calmly might spend time in the courtyards where fresh air and sunlight provided a change from the enclosed wards. Others remained within their rooms under supervision. The use of restraints was an accepted part of managing patients whose behaviour became difficult to control. Chains fixed to walls or heavy rings could limit movement during episodes of agitation. Leather straps or jackets designed to secure the arms were also used when attendants believed someone might harm themselves or others. These methods were not applied continuously to every patient. Staff members tried to release restraints when individuals appeared calm enough to move freely. However, for those experiencing frequent episodes of distress, restraints sometimes remained in place for long periods. From the perspective of the hospital's administrators, these measures were considered necessary tools for maintaining order in an environment where residents often behaved unpredictably. Attendants received practical training through experience rather than formal instruction. New staff members learned by observing older workers who had spent years managing the wards. They became familiar with the rhythms of the institution and the individual habits of patients. Some residents spoke constantly throughout the day, while others rarely spoke at all. Some paced their rooms repeatedly, while others preferred to sit quietly for hours. Recognizing these patterns helped attendants anticipate when someone might become distressed. Midday meals provided another moment of structure within the day. Stews or thick broths made from grains and vegetables were distributed along with bread. Staff ensured that patients ate regularly and drank sufficient water or weak ale. Following the meal, activity within the hospital usually slowed. Many residents rested during the afternoon hours, while attendants completed maintenance tasks such as cleaning the wards or repairing bedding. Physicians occasionally visited during these hours to examine patients who appeared particularly troubled. They continued recommending treatments rooted in humoral theory. Bloodletting, purging medicines, and herbal preparations remained the most common interventions. For patients whose agitation was severe, physicians sometimes recommended cold water treatments or other methods intended to calm emotional excitement. These approaches reflected the medical beliefs of the period, rather than systematic scientific evidence. Despite these efforts, the majority of patients experienced little improvement from treatment. Mental illness remained poorly understood, and the hospital functioned primarily as a place of containment. Evening meals were served before darkness settled across the city. Bread, broth, and vegetables again formed the basic diet. Afterward, attendants prepared the wards for the night. Candles or oil lamps provided limited light as staff guided patients back to their rooms. Doors were secured to ensure that residents remained within the designated areas. Night supervision was essential. Some individuals became restless during the dark hours, walking through their rooms or speaking aloud without clear direction. Attendants remained awake in shifts, listening for signs that someone might require assistance. The quiet corridors of the Moorfields Hospital carried these sounds easily. Footsteps, voices, and occasional movement echoed along the long hallways. Outside the hospital, London continued moving through its daily cycle. Markets closed, shops locked their doors, and households settled into evening routines. Inside Bethlem, however, the work of supervision continued without interruption. The system of chains, cells, and routines created a controlled environment designed to manage residents whose minds did not follow ordinary patterns. While the methods could appear severe, they reflected the limited knowledge and resources available to the institution. At the same time, criticism of these practices slowly began emerging among certain observers. Some physicians and writers argued that harsh restraint might worsen mental disturbance rather than calm it. They suggested that more humane approaches could help patients regain stability. These early criticisms were still uncommon, but they marked the beginning of a shift in public thinking about how individuals with mental illness should be treated. Bethlem therefore stood at a point where traditional practices continued dominating daily life, yet new ideas were beginning to circulate beyond its walls. Within the hospital itself, however, change came slowly. The reality inside Bedlam. By the middle of the 18th century, Bethlem Royal Hospital had developed into one of the most recognisable institutions in London. The long Moorfields building contained a carefully arranged series of rooms designed to house patients whose behaviour could not easily be managed elsewhere. Although the hospital appeared impressive from the outside, life inside its walls was far more ordinary and often uncomfortable. The building itself stretched across a long rectangular structure divided into two main wings. Each side of the hospital contained rows of rooms connected by long corridors that attendants could patrol throughout the day. Historical records suggest that during much of the 18th century, the hospital held roughly 100 to 120 patients, though the number sometimes rose higher as London's population continued to grow. The number of rooms varied slightly over time as spaces were modified, but the Moorfields building generally contained over 100 small patient rooms, each designed to house either a single individual or, in calmer cases, two patients together. Most of these rooms were simple and narrow. The walls were made of thick masonry designed to prevent damage and to reduce noise travelling between rooms. The floors were wooden planks that could be cleaned when necessary, though wear from constant use made them rough and uneven in many places. The furnishings were minimal. A typical patient room contained a wooden bed frame, fixed firmly to the floor or wall. On the frame rested a mattress filled with straw or coarse stuffing. Blankets were usually made from thick wool, and pillows were often small or absent entirely. Furniture beyond the bed was rare. Some rooms included a wooden stool or small table, but many contained nothing except the bed and the iron fixtures used for restraint when necessary. Windows were narrow and placed high in the walls. Heavy iron bars reinforced them from the outside. These openings allowed daylight and air to enter the rooms while ensuring that patients could not climb through them. Ventilation varied depending on the weather. During warmer months, the air moved freely through the corridors and wards, but during cold seasons, shutters were often closed to retain warmth, which sometimes left the interior rooms heavy and stale. Sanitation inside the hospital was basic. Each ward contained containers used for waste, which attendants emptied at regular intervals. The staff attempted to keep the building reasonably clean, but with dozens of residents living in close quarters, the environment was rarely fresh. The smell inside the corridors could vary throughout the day. Cooking from the hospital kitchen produced the scent of broth or boiled vegetables during meal preparation. At other times, the mixture of damp bedding, straw mattresses, and human presence created a heavier atmosphere that lingered in the enclosed spaces. Patients themselves wore simple clothing provided by the hospital when their own garments were no longer usable. These clothes were usually made from coarse wool or linen. Shirts, trousers, and simple gowns formed the basic wardrobe for residents. Because resources were limited, clothing was often reused after cleaning, and garments could become worn through constant washing and use. The daily schedule followed a pattern that changed very little from one day to the next. Patients were awakened early in the morning when attendants began walking the corridors. Staff checked each room, ensuring that residents were awake and that no one had injured themselves during the night. Breakfast followed shortly afterward. The meal was modest but consistent. Bread formed the central part of the diet. Large loaves baked in the hospital kitchen were sliced and distributed among the patients. Alongside bread, patients often received porridge made from oats or barley, cooked slowly in large kettles. The porridge was filling and easy to prepare in large quantities, making it practical for feeding many people. Water was the most common drink, though weak beer or ale was sometimes served. Such beverages were widely consumed in England during this period, because fermentation helped reduce contamination from untreated water. Midday meals were slightly more varied. Stews prepared from vegetables and grains formed the basis of lunch. Cabbage, peas, onions and root vegetables were commonly used because they could be stored for long periods. When donations or supplies allowed, small portions of meat or fish were added to these stews. Meat was not served every day, but it appeared often enough to provide additional nourishment. The evening meal was similar to earlier meals: bread, broth, and occasionally vegetables or leftover stew from midday cooking. Although the food was simple, the hospital made consistent efforts to ensure that patients received regular meals. Maintaining physical health was considered an important part of keeping residents stable. During the daytime hours, patients were allowed limited movement depending on their condition. Those who behaved calmly could walk within certain corridors or spend time in the enclosed courtyards attached to the hospital. These outdoor spaces allowed fresh air and sunlight to reach patients who otherwise spent much of their time indoors. Other residents remained in their rooms if attendants believed their behaviour might disturb others. Attendants supervised these movements carefully. Their primary responsibility was maintaining safety within the hospital. The staff members were not physicians or scholars. Most were practical workers who learned their duties through experience. Over time, they developed an understanding of the patient's habits and moods. Some attendants treated patients with patience and routine kindness, speaking calmly and guiding residents through daily activities. Others were stricter in their methods, relying heavily on restraint and firm control when behaviour became difficult. Restraints remained a regular part of hospital management. Iron rings fixed to walls allowed chains to secure individuals who became violent or dangerously agitated. Leather straps or special jackets designed to limit arm movement were also used in certain situations. These restraints were intended to prevent injury rather than serve as punishment, though from the patient's perspective they could be deeply uncomfortable. Because mental illness was poorly understood, attendants often believed that controlling physical movement would help calm emotional disturbance. The number of staff working in the hospital remained relatively small compared to the number of patients. This meant attendants had to monitor several rooms at once as they walked the corridors. Experience taught them which residents required constant observation and which could remain safely in their rooms for longer periods. Despite the strict routines and restraints, Bethlem was not entirely a place of constant turmoil. Many patients spent long hours in quiet states of reflection or withdrawal. The hospital could be silent for extended stretches, interrupted only by the footsteps of attendants or the sounds of activity in the kitchen. Yet at other times the building echoed with voices, movement, or sudden agitation from individuals whose minds were unsettled. The age of reformers. By the latter half of the 18th century, attitudes toward institutions like Bethlem Royal Hospital were beginning to change. For many decades, the hospital had operated under traditions that emphasized supervision, restraint, and routine. These methods were widely accepted because society had few other ways to respond to mental disturbance. Yet new ideas circulating through Europe were gradually encouraging people to reconsider how individuals with troubled minds should be treated. The intellectual climate of the Enlightenment placed increasing value on reason, observation, and the belief that human behaviour could be studied and understood. Philosophers, physicians, and social reformers began examining institutions that cared for vulnerable members of society. Hospitals, prisons, and poorhouses all came under scrutiny during this period. Observers asked whether these institutions were truly helping the people they housed or simply isolating them from the rest of society. Bethlem attracted particular attention because of its growing reputation. By this time, the word Bedlam had become firmly established in English language and literature as a symbol of disorder. Writers referred to the hospital when describing scenes of chaos, and visitors continued arriving to see the patients inside its wards. For some observers, these visits raised troubling questions. They wondered whether allowing members of the public to walk through the hospital and watch the residents was appropriate. Although the donations collected from visitors helped support the institution financially, critics argued that the practice risked turning human suffering into spectacle. These concerns slowly gained attention among physicians and social commentators. Medical writers began describing the conditions they observed inside Bethlem with increasing detail. Their accounts discussed the use of restraints, the small patient rooms, and the limited treatments available for those living within the hospital. While many doctors still accepted the traditional methods of restraint and supervision, some began suggesting that gentler approaches might produce better results. One of the central ideas emerging during this period was the belief that mental illness might improve when patients were treated with calmness and respect rather than harsh discipline. Physicians who supported this view argued that agitation could worsen when individuals felt confined or threatened. Instead, they recommended creating environments where patients could experience regular activity, conversation, and kindness. These ideas did not appear suddenly, and they were not universally accepted. Many hospital administrators believed that strict control remained necessary to prevent injury or disorder within crowded wards. Nevertheless, reformers continued raising questions about whether existing practices truly served the needs of patients. Public opinion also began shifting slowly. As literacy increased and printed materials circulated more widely, descriptions of life inside institutions reached a broader audience. Pamphlets and essays discussing social reform attracted readers interested in improving the conditions of hospitals, prisons, and other facilities responsible for vulnerable populations. Within this growing conversation, Bethlem often appeared as a prominent example. Some writers criticized the continued use of chains and restraints, suggesting that such methods might deepen the distress experienced by patients. Others focused on the practice of public tours, arguing that observing residents for entertainment showed little respect for human dignity. Hospital administrators did not ignore these criticisms entirely. Discussions about possible improvements gradually reached the governing authorities responsible for Bethlem. However, practical change moved slowly. The hospital still faced financial limitations, and the number of patients continued increasing as London's population expanded. Maintaining safety within the institution remained a priority for the staff responsible for supervising residents. Even so, the influence of reform-minded thinkers could be felt in subtle ways. Physicians visiting the hospital sometimes encouraged attendants to observe patients more carefully rather than relying immediately on restraint. They suggested that understanding individual behaviour patterns might help reduce agitation. These suggestions did not eliminate traditional practices, but they introduced the idea that mental illness might respond to careful management rather than simple confinement. Meanwhile, the hospital itself continued functioning much as it had for decades. Attendants walked the long corridors each morning, checking on residents and ensuring that meals were distributed according to schedule. Patients spent their days within the wards or courtyards, depending on their condition. Visitors still arrived at the gates, though debates about the appropriateness of these tours grew more frequent. London during this time remained a city of rapid growth and cultural change. Coffee houses hosted discussions about science, politics, and philosophy. Newspapers carried reports of debates taking place across Europe about the rights and responsibilities of governments and institutions. Within this atmosphere, the treatment of individuals with mental illness gradually became part of a broader conversation about humanity and social responsibility. Reformers argued that hospitals should aim not only to contain patients, but also to offer conditions that might help restore stability when possible. These ideas represented a new direction in thinking about mental health care. Although the transformation of institutions like Bethlem would take many years, the late 18th century marked the beginning of this process. The hospital that had once been viewed primarily as a place of confinement was now being examined through a different lens. Observers were beginning to ask whether individuals living inside its walls deserved more humane surroundings and greater attention to their well-being. The discussions sparked during this era would soon lead to significant reforms across England's mental health institutions. And Bethlem, with its long and complex history, would find itself at the centre of these changes, changing ideas about madness. By the closing years of the 18th century, ideas about the nature of mental illness were beginning to shift in ways that would gradually influence institutions like Bethlem Royal Hospital. For centuries, explanations for disturbed behaviour had relied heavily on humoral theory, religious interpretation, or simple observation. Now, physicians and philosophers were starting to approach the subject with a different kind of curiosity. The Enlightenment had encouraged scholars to believe that human behaviour could be studied carefully and explained through observation and reason. This belief extended to the mind itself. Rather than viewing madness only as an imbalance of bodily humours or a mysterious spiritual problem, some thinkers suggested that mental illness might involve disruptions in thought, emotion, and perception. Medical writers began describing symptoms in greater detail. Instead of grouping all forms of mental disturbance together, they attempted to distinguish between different patterns of behaviour. Some patients experienced deep sadness and withdrawal, a condition often referred to as melancholy. Others displayed agitation, restless speech, or bursts of energy that seemed difficult to control. Still others appeared confused or detached from reality, speaking in ways that did not follow ordinary logic. These descriptions did not yet lead to effective treatments, but they represented an effort to understand mental illness more precisely. Bethlem Royal Hospital remained one of the places where physicians could observe such conditions directly. Because the hospital housed a range of patients whose behaviour varied widely, it provided examples that doctors could study. During visits to the hospital, physicians sometimes recorded their observations about how patients behaved at different times of day or under different circumstances. They asked attendants about sleeping patterns, appetite, speech, and mood. These records contributed to the gradual development of early psychiatric thinking. At the same time, reformers continued questioning the traditional methods used to manage patients inside institutions. Many critics believed that chains and harsh restraints might increase agitation rather than calm it. They argued that fear and confinement could deepen the emotional distress experienced by individuals already struggling with mental confusion. Instead, some physicians proposed a different approach. They suggested that patients might respond better to environments that provided regular activity, conversation, and a sense of dignity. Calm surroundings, fresh air, and respectful treatment were thought to help restore balance to the mind. These ideas came to be known as moral treatment, a concept that would influence mental health care across Europe during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The phrase did not refer to morality in a religious sense. Instead, it described an approach that focused on guiding patients through routine, kindness, and structured activity. Advocates of moral treatment believed that individuals experiencing mental illness should be treated as people capable of improvement rather than simply confined as dangerous or unpredictable. The earliest examples of this approach appeared in smaller private institutions where reform-minded physicians experimented with new methods. In England, one of the most influential developments occurred in York at the end of the 18th century. A group of reformers established the York Retreat, an institution designed to provide a calmer and more humane environment for patients experiencing mental illness. At the York Retreat, staff members emphasized quiet surroundings, respectful communication, and meaningful daily activities. Patients were encouraged to walk in gardens, read books, and participate in gentle work when possible. The success of this institution attracted attention from physicians across Britain. Although Bethlem was a much larger and older hospital with long-established traditions, the ideas emerging from places like the York Retreat began influencing how doctors thought about care within asylums. Medical journals and pamphlets discussing these reforms circulated through London, reaching physicians connected with Bethlem. Gradually, some doctors began suggesting that the hospital might adopt similar principles. However, Implementing these ideas within Bethlem presented significant challenges. The institution housed far more patients than smaller reform centres, and its staff had limited resources for restructuring the environment. Many attendants were accustomed to traditional methods that emphasised restraint and strict control. Even so, the growing influence of reform movements could not be ignored. Public opinion was also beginning to change. Readers who encountered descriptions of moral treatment in newspapers and essays started questioning whether older institutions should adapt their practices. Visitors who toured Bethlem sometimes compared what they saw inside the hospital with the more humane approaches being described elsewhere. These comparisons added pressure for reform. At the same time, London itself continued evolving as a centre of intellectual and social debate. Scientific societies, universities, and professional organisations provided spaces where physicians discussed new discoveries and exchanged ideas. Within these discussions, mental illness gradually emerged as a field worthy of serious study. Bethlem, therefore, stood at an important moment in its long history. For centuries, the hospital had functioned primarily as a place of containment. Patients were supervised, restrained when necessary, and housed within structured routines designed to prevent disorder. Now, however, new ideas suggested that such institutions might also play a role in helping patients regain stability. These ideas would take time to influence everyday practice, but they marked a turning point in the way society viewed mental illness. Instead of treating disturbed behaviour solely as a problem to be controlled, reformers began asking whether it might be understood, studied, and even improved through thoughtful care, moving toward humanity. As the 19th century approached, the growing conversation about reform began slowly influencing the administration of Bethlem Royal Hospital. The institution had long relied on traditional methods of supervision and restraint, but the wider intellectual environment of Britain was changing. Physicians, lawmakers, and social observers were now discussing how hospitals and asylums might operate with greater humanity. These discussions were not limited to Bethlem alone. Across England, the number of institutions caring for people with mental illness had begun increasing. The rapid growth of cities created new challenges for communities trying to manage individuals whose behaviour made daily life difficult. Because Bethlem was one of the oldest and most widely known hospitals associated with mental disturbance, it remained an important example in these debates. Medical professionals who supported reform believed that the physical environment of a hospital could influence the mental condition of its residents. They argued that surroundings filled with noise, confinement, and restraint might increase agitation rather than calm it. Instead, reformers proposed that patients should experience predictable routines, fresh air, and respectful treatment. The concept of moral treatment, which had gained attention in institutions such as the York Retreat, encouraged attendants to interact with patients in ways that promoted stability rather than fear. Staff members were encouraged to speak calmly, maintain orderly surroundings, and guide residents through daily activities that gave them structure. Some physicians connected with Bethlem began expressing interest in these ideas. They suggested that the hospital might gradually adopt practices that reduced reliance on heavy restraints and improved the daily experience of patients. Change inside such a large and long-established institution did not happen quickly. Bethlem still housed a significant number of residents, many of whom experienced severe mental disturbance that attendants struggled to manage. Nevertheless, small adjustments began appearing. Attendants were encouraged to observe patients more carefully before applying restraints. If a person appeared restless or anxious, staff sometimes attempted conversation or redirection rather than immediate confinement. Outdoor access also received greater attention. The courtyards and surrounding spaces attached to the hospital allowed certain patients to walk under supervision. Reformers believed that fresh air and physical movement could help reduce emotional agitation. These changes reflected a gradual shift in thinking rather than a sudden transformation. Medical understanding of mental illness was still limited, but physicians increasingly believed that environment and social interaction might influence recovery. Hospital administrators also faced pressure from the public. By the early 19th century, newspapers and pamphlets discussing the treatment of asylum patients circulated widely. Readers who encountered these accounts sometimes questioned whether older institutions should modernise their practices. Bethlem's long history meant that it remained closely associated with the word Bedlam, which had come to symbolise confusion and disorder. Reformers hoped that improving the conditions inside the hospital might eventually reshape that reputation. During this period, government authorities also began examining the regulation of institutions responsible for mental health care. Committees and inspectors were occasionally appointed to investigate the operation of hospitals and private asylums. Their reports discussed issues such as overcrowding, sanitation, and patient supervision. Although these investigations did not immediately produce sweeping reforms, they created a framework for increased oversight. Bethlem's administrators therefore found themselves balancing tradition with the growing expectation that hospitals should adopt more humane standards. Inside the Moorfields building, daily life continued following familiar patterns. Patients woke early each morning as attendants began their rounds through the corridors. Breakfast was distributed bread, porridge, and occasionally broth or vegetables depending on the supplies available. Residents then spent the morning hours within their assigned spaces. Some walked in the courtyards when attendance permitted it, while others remained inside their rooms. Staff members watched carefully for signs of distress or agitation. Restraints were still used when necessary, but reform-minded physicians encouraged attendants to remove them whenever possible. The goal was to maintain safety without imposing unnecessary confinement. Midday meals provided nourishment and structure within the day. Stews prepared from grains and vegetables were common, with small portions of meat or fish added when donations allowed. The afternoon hours often passed quietly. Some patients rested, while others engaged in simple tasks that helped pass the time. Attendants continued performing maintenance duties around the hospital, cleaning rooms, repairing bedding, and ensuring that the wards remained orderly. Evening meals occurred before nightfall, followed by preparations for sleep. Candles or lamps provided limited lighting as attendants guided residents back to their rooms. Night supervision remained essential. Staff members stayed awake in shifts, listening for sounds that indicated someone might require assistance. Although these routines had existed for decades, the attitudes behind them were slowly changing. Reformers believed that the way patients were treated could influence their mental state. Calm surroundings, regular activity, and respectful interaction were now seen as important elements of care. These ideas would eventually lead to broader reforms across England's mental health system. Bethlem, with its long history and prominent reputation, would inevitably play a role in that transformation. The hospital had begun as a small charitable refuge in the 13th century. Over centuries, it had evolved into an institution widely known for housing individuals whose minds troubled them, from infamy to medical institution. As the 19th century progressed, the long history of Bethlem Royal Hospital entered a new stage. For hundreds of years, the institution had been known mainly as a place of confinement. The word Bedlam had become a common expression for chaos, and the hospital's reputation had spread far beyond the streets of London. Yet the changing ideas about mental illness that had begun in the late 18th century were now influencing the structure of mental health care across Britain. Physicians, lawmakers, and reformers increasingly believed that hospitals should function as places of medical treatment rather than simple containment. One of the most important developments during this period was the gradual introduction of national oversight for institutions caring for people with mental illness. Throughout the early 19th century, Parliament began passing legislation designed to regulate asylums and protect patients. Committees were formed to investigate how hospitals operated, and inspectors were appointed to examine conditions within these institutions. These changes reflected a growing belief that mental illness required organised medical attention and careful supervision. Bethlem Royal Hospital, as one of the oldest and most visible asylums in England, naturally became part of these reforms. Administrators faced increasing pressure to modernise the institution. Reports written by visitors and inspectors discussed issues such as overcrowding, sanitation, and the continued use of heavy restraints. Although many staff members had already begun adopting gentler methods of supervision, the hospital's long traditions were slow to change. Gradually, however, improvements began to appear. One of the most significant developments involved the professionalization of medical staff. Physicians who specialized in the study of mental illness began taking more active roles within hospitals. These doctors believed that careful observation of patients could help identify patterns in behavior and symptoms. By studying these patterns, they hoped to understand the nature of mental illness more clearly. Bethlem therefore began moving toward a structure in which physicians played a greater role in daily decision-making. Medical records became more detailed. Doctors documented the behavior, mood, and physical condition of patients over time. These observations allowed them to track changes and experiment with different forms of treatment. The hospital also expanded its efforts to provide structured activities for residents. Rather than leaving patients idle for long hours, staff began encouraging participation in simple tasks that provided routine and purpose. Walking outdoors, assisting with light household work, or engaging in quiet reading became part of the daily schedule for patients who were able to participate. These activities reflected the growing influence of moral treatment. Reformers believed that meaningful occupation could help restore mental stability. Giving patients regular responsibilities allowed them to feel connected to daily life, rather than isolated within their rooms. At the same time, the use of restraints gradually declined. Chains and heavy restraints had been common tools for managing agitation in earlier centuries. By the mid-19th century, many physicians argued that these methods should be used only when absolutely necessary. Hospitals across Britain began reducing their reliance on such devices, favouring supervision and calm communication instead. Bethlem followed this trend, though the process took time due to the number of patients and the complexity of their conditions. Another important change involved the hospital's physical environment. The Moorfields building, which had once symbolised progress when it opened in the 17th century, was eventually considered inadequate for the needs of a modern medical institution. As the population of patients increased, administrators recognised that larger and better designed facilities were required. In the early 19th century, plans were developed to relocate the hospital once again. Bethlem moved from Moorfields to a new site at St George's Fields in South London in 1815. The new location offered more space and improved facilities designed specifically for the care of patients with mental illness. The buildings included larger wards, improved ventilation, and more outdoor areas where residents could walk and exercise. These changes reflected the evolving belief that environment played an important role in mental health. Fresh air, sunlight, and structured surroundings were now considered beneficial for patients recovering from emotional distress. Visitors were still permitted to enter the hospital during certain periods, but the practice gradually became more restricted than it had been during earlier centuries. Public tours had once contributed to the hospital's finances, yet reformers argued that patients deserved privacy and dignity. Over time, administrators limited access to ensure that the hospital functioned primarily as a place of care rather than spectacle. The language used to describe mental illness also began changing during the 19th century. Physicians increasingly referred to patients using medical terminology rather than the older labels that had emphasized confusion or madness. Words such as insanity and later mental illness became more common in official reports. These changes reflected a broader shift in understanding. Mental disturbance was no longer viewed solely as a social problem that required containment. It was gradually being recognized as a medical condition deserving study and treatment. Bethlem's long history meant that it carried the weight of centuries of tradition. Yet by the middle of the 19th century, the institution had begun moving toward a new identity. The hospital that had once been famous for chains and public curiosity was now evolving into a medical facility where physicians studied the human mind and attempted to provide care for those experiencing mental distress. The long shadow of Bethlem. By the 19th century, Bethlem Royal Hospital had already passed through many stages of transformation. What had begun in 1247 as a small charitable refuge connected to religious life had slowly developed into one of the most recognised institutions in England associated with mental illness. Over hundreds of years, the hospital had adapted to changing ideas about medicine, social responsibility, and the nature of the human mind. The move to the new buildings at St George's Fields marked an important step in that transformation. The larger grounds allowed the hospital to create more open spaces where patients could walk under supervision. Physicians and attendants believed that fresh air, sunlight, and a calmer physical environment might help stabilise individuals experiencing mental distress. Inside the new hospital, daily routines continued to provide structure. Patients still woke early each morning as attendants began their rounds. Meals were prepared in the kitchen and distributed according to schedule. Bread, vegetables, porridge and stews remained the foundation of the diet, though improvements in supply and organisation sometimes allowed greater variety. Residents spent their days moving between indoor wards and outdoor spaces depending on their condition. Some participated in light work such as gardening, cleaning, or assisting with simple tasks around the hospital. Others rested quietly or walked through the grounds under supervision. These routines reflected the growing belief that structured activity could help maintain emotional balance. Medical staff played a larger role in the hospital than in earlier centuries. Physicians now kept detailed records describing each patient's behaviour, physical health, and emotional condition. These notes allowed doctors to observe patterns and compare different cases over time. Although treatments remained limited by the scientific knowledge of the period, the practice of documenting symptoms represented an important step toward understanding mental illness more systematically. The hospital also continued evolving as the 19th century progressed. Improvements in sanitation, ventilation, and building design helped create safer environments for patients and staff. Wards were organised more carefully, separating individuals according to the nature of their condition. At the same time, national legislation regulating asylums became more developed. Government oversight introduced inspections and standards designed to protect the welfare of patients living within institutions. These laws did not solve every problem, but they reflected society's increasing awareness that people with mental illness deserved proper care and protection. Bethlem's long history made it an important reference point in these discussions. Because the hospital had existed for so many centuries, observers often looked to it when examining how attitudes toward mental illness had changed. The contrast between its earliest days and the reforms of the 19th century illustrated how dramatically society's understanding of mental health had evolved. In the medieval world, disturbed behaviour had often been explained through religious belief or mysterious imbalance within the body. Institutions like Bethlem served primarily as places where individuals could be supervised when their behaviour could not easily be managed elsewhere. Over time, however, physicians and reformers began approaching the subject with new questions. They asked whether mental illness might be studied scientifically. They examined how environment, routine, and social interaction influenced emotional stability. They debated whether hospitals should provide not only supervision, but also meaningful treatment. These questions gradually reshaped the purpose of institutions caring for people with mental illness. Bethlem's reputation as Bedlam remained part of its cultural legacy. The word continued appearing in literature, journalism, and everyday speech as a symbol of disorder, yet the hospital itself was moving away from that image. It had become a medical institution, where doctors and attendants worked together to understand and manage complex mental conditions. The changes did not happen all at once. Reform came slowly, influenced by debates among physicians, lawmakers, and the public. Even as new ideas spread, older practices sometimes remained in place for many years. The transformation of mental health care was therefore gradual, unfolding across generations rather than within a single moment. Yet by the late 19th century, the direction of change was clear. Mental illness was increasingly recognised as a condition that required study, compassion, and structured treatment. Hospitals like Bethlem played an important role in that developing system. The institution continued operating through the centuries that followed, adapting again and again as medical knowledge expanded. New therapies, new scientific discoveries, and new approaches to psychology would eventually reshape mental health care in ways that early physicians could hardly have imagined. Still, the early history of Bethlem remained significant. It showed how societies respond to conditions they do not fully understand. It revealed how institutions evolve as knowledge grows and attitudes change. And it reminded observers that the treatment of vulnerable individuals often reflects the values of the wider community. The hospital, founded in medieval London, had left a lasting mark on language, culture, and medicine.